So, my buddy Austin and I were out traipsing through the woods one day, supposed to be hunting. We hadn't seen a single deer, not even a squirrel, nothing. The woods were dead quiet, and our hopes of bringing home some venison were fading faster than a cheap tattoo. After a while of nothing, we decided to ditch the main hunting grounds and head over to this patch of power lines about a mile away, just to stretch our legs and get some fresh air. We stumbled across this huge rock next to an even bigger boulder and figured it was a good spot to chill for a bit. We cracked open some sodas and started chucking rocks, trying to ricochet them off the big boulder. It was pretty lame, but it passed the time. Then, we noticed this dude on a hill about a mile away just standing there, pointing something at us. It was either a camera or a phone, too far to tell, but he was definitely aiming it in our direction. We sat there for a while longer, and this guy just kept filming us, or at least staring us down. Austin, never one to back down from a challenge, flipped the guy the bird and held it there for a good 5 minutes straight. That's when the silent watcher finally lost it. He started screaming at us, just a bunch of unintelligible yelling, pure, unfiltered rage. We figured it was time to bail and head back to camp. But as soon as we started walking, the yelling got louder. This guy was running down the hill towards us, full-on sprinting. We took off jogging, trying to put some distance between us and this lunatic. We kept running for about a mile, thinking we'd finally lost it. We slowed down to grab some berries off a bush, trying to catch our breath. We looked up, and guess who? Mr. Psycho was back, power walking right towards us. And as soon as he spotted us, the shouting started all over again. This time, we didn't mess around. We sprinted the entire rest of the way back to camp, and the crazy guy was right behind us, keeping pace. By the time we burst into camp, we were completely winded and totally freaked out. Our folks heard all the yelling and came running out to see what was going on. Austin blurted out that some crazy dude was chasing us, and right on cue, the guy burst out of the woods and into our campsite. He was only about 50 yards away now, and we got a good look at him for the first time. Ripped clothes, wild eyes, the whole 9 yards. He was still screaming and cursing as he came into the clearing, and then he pulled out a knife from a sheath on his side. That's when my dad grabbed his shotgun and yelled at the guy to stop, to turn around and leave, or he'd shoot. The guy didn't even flinch. He took a few more steps towards us, still yelling nonsense. It wasn't until my Uncle Joe showed up with his rifle raised that the guy finally froze. He let out one last string of curses and mumbled something about us being on his property before turning around and stomping back up the mountain into the woods. We called the cops, and they told us that characters like him often hung out on the other side of those power lines. Apparently, there was a homeless camp up there, a spot where addicts and drifters would set up tents. It's been years now, but we still laugh about that day. We call it the day we ticked off the protector of the power lines. But even though we joke about it now, it was seriously scary when we saw that knife. It's a good thing he didn't catch up to us before we made it back to camp. Now, before we move on to the next story, if you're new and enjoyed this one, please subscribe. It helps us out a ton. If you want more chilling tales, hit that button. And with that said, let's get into our next story. This freaky thing happened when I was around 10 or 11. My mom and I were camping by this river in the middle of nowhere. It was just the two of us. No other campers, no nothing. The closest farmhouse was a couple of miles away, so we were basically out in the boonies. We'd set up our tent and had a small campfire going when, just before dark, this dude shows up at our site. Now, the area was open to anyone who wanted to camp. So seeing someone else wasn't totally weird, but this guy had zero gear with him. Not a backpack, not a sleeping bag, nothing. He started chatting with us, making small talk, and eventually got around to warning us about wild dogs in the area, and that we should be careful. My mom and I were getting a little creeped out because he wasn't leaving. He actually said he'd stick around for a while to protect us from these wild dogs. My mom politely hinted, like, a bunch of times that we'd be fine and that he was welcome to go, but he just wouldn't take the hint. He hung around for what felt like forever, and there wasn't much we could do since it was a public campsite. He had every right to be there, even if he didn't have any camping gear. Finally, my mom told him we were heading into the tent for the night, thanked him for the company, and said we'd be fine on our own. I whispered to my mom if she thought he was going to hurt us, and she said, "Of course not," but her voice kind of cracked, and I could tell she was scared too. We didn't want to provoke him, but we also didn't want to seem afraid, so we just crawled into our tent while this guy stayed sitting on a log by the fire. I don't think my mom slept a wink that night. She had a knife tucked right next to her in the tent, just in case. I peeked at the guy through the tent flap for a while. At one point, he pulled out this long knife and started sharpening it on a stick. He just stared down at the blade, slowly running it along the stick, making this creepy scraping sound. I asked my mom again if he was going to kill us, and she kept saying no, but I knew she was worried sick. She was trying to hide it, but she was definitely prepared for the worst. I eventually drifted off to sleep, but I kept waking up and seeing my mom still awake, just lying there and listening to that awful scraping sound. By morning, the guy was gone. I have no idea how long he'd stayed or when he'd left. After we packed up our stuff, we stopped by the nearest farmhouse to tell someone about the strange encounter. The old guy there listened to our story, chuckled a bit, and said, "Oh, that's just Earl. He means well, just doesn't have a lick of common sense." Apparently, he lived on a nearby farm, and the old guy promised he'd talk to his neighbor and tell him to stop being so weird and intrusive. A few years later, after that crazy camping trip, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was watching the news, and they were talking about this guy who'd been arrested, a suspect in several missing person cases. They showed his photo on TV, and even though it had been years, I instantly recognized him. It was the same guy who'd been at our campsite. His name was Earl D., a serial killer who'd been picking up hitchhikers along the highways, killing them and burying their bodies in the woods, right across the river from where we'd camped. I can't even describe how I felt when I realized it. The guy who'd been lurking outside our tent, sharpening a knife, talking about wild dogs, was a freaking serial killer. We'd been so close to him, and we had no idea at the time. I don't think I'll ever forget that night and how lucky we were, but it still gives me the chills. When I was 15, I had this summer job a few miles from my house. I lived in a really rural, wooded area. My parents had this strict rule about me not going into the woods alone. But they both worked during the day, and my job started at noon, so I had to walk. I decided to be rebellious and take a shortcut through the woods instead of walking along the road. It shaved off about a mile from my walk, which was a big deal in the summer heat. So every day at the same time, I'd trek through this super deserted state forest, following a deer path for about a mile until it met up with a railroad track. Then, I'd walk a couple more miles along the tracks into town to get to work. This whole route totally freaked me out. I always felt like someone was watching me, but it was shorter and shadier than the road, so I wouldn't get all sweaty before work. Most days, I ignored my parents' warnings, and they'd pick me up after my shift, totally clueless about my little daily adventure. This went on for weeks. Then, one day, I was walking about a mile from any houses deep in the woods, and I saw these two ripped-out pages from porn magazines just lying on the trail, facing me. They definitely hadn't been there the day before. I was completely creeped out. It was obvious they'd been placed there on purpose, probably for me, since hardly anyone ever went through that area. But I kept walking, because if I turned back then, I'd have to walk even further to get out of the woods, and I'd be late for work. The woods there were super thick with brambles, dogwood trees, and these rolling hills, so you couldn't see very far in any direction. Suddenly, I heard someone else walking nearby. I stopped, and I heard them stop too, just for a second. It sounded like they had loose change jingling in their pocket. So I knew it wasn't an animal because of the echo. I couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. Just to make sure I wasn't imagining things, I stopped again, and I heard the same noise, which immediately stopped when I did. That's when it hit me. I was being stalked. My gut told me not to say anything, not to run, just to keep walking down the deer path, deeper into the woods. It also told me not to look behind me. I could feel someone right behind me on the path now, but I didn't dare look back. Back then I was pretty short and a little chubby, and if you just looked at me, you probably wouldn't think I was a fast runner. So, if someone wanted to catch me in the woods, they might think they had plenty of time. But what they didn't know was that I ran cross-country and track at school. I could run a 7-minute mile, and hills were my specialty. I wasn't an amazing runner by any means, but I knew I was probably faster than whoever this creep was. I wasn't really thinking all this through at the time. It was just instinct. I knew I shouldn't run yet. I kept walking, seemingly going deeper into the woods, because I knew the train tracks were up ahead, and there'd be more open space to run without tripping or getting caught on branches. It was terrifying not to look back, but something just told me not to. I kept walking like nothing was happening, didn't turn around once. I could feel the person maybe 20 feet behind me at this point, following me for a good eighth of a mile. As soon as I got close to the tracks, I took off. I ran as fast as I could, scrambling on all fours up the last hill before the tracks, grabbing onto weeds to pull myself up, and then I just sprinted along the tracks as fast as my legs and lungs would carry me. I heard and saw branches snapping down below me in the woods, but now I was out in the sunlight and the woods were dark, so I couldn't see what was behind the branches. I just kept sprinting. I never saw the person, but I knew whatever they were planning wasn't good. I never took that shortcut through the woods again, and I never told my parents what happened, because I was terrified of being grounded. This happened about 15 years ago when I was a sophomore in college in New York. Within the first couple of months of freshman year, I'd fallen in with this tight-knit group of friends who were all obsessed with horror movies and going on adventures. So at the start of sophomore year, we decided that in October, around Halloween, we'd find a seriously creepy wooded area and go exploring. After some digging, we found this really isolated spot about 30 minutes away that was supposedly notorious for paranormal activity. The 7 of us piled into 2 cars and headed out. We turned off this busy main road, lined with strip malls and restaurants, and bam! We were instantly swallowed by complete darkness. This area was seriously overgrown with trees. It was basically a maze of winding roads surrounded by woods, barely any streetlights, and hardly any houses. We all made sure our phones were fully charged and had flashlights just in case. But the plan was to keep driving until we found a good spot to pull over and start exploring. We took a left off the main road and drove for about 30 minutes into the inky blackness of the woods, picking directions at random, basically trying to get lost. Finally, our car made a turn, and there it was, a massive log blocking the road. We'd reached a dead end with nothing but trees beyond it. We all hopped out to check it out and stepped over the log. We saw 2 narrow trails leading off in different directions. This seemed like as good a time as any to grab our flashlights and start exploring. We flipped a coin and took the trail to the right. The trail was so narrow we had to walk single file to avoid getting smacked in the face by branches. For some reason, I ended up at the back of the line. I'm usually pretty rational and even-tempered, but I gotta say, the further we went in, the more this uneasy feeling settled over me. I kept hearing noises deeper in the woods and couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. But I seemed to be the only one hearing anything, so I just chalked it up to my imagination. Besides, the whole point of being there was to get spooked, so I didn't want to be the one to suggest turning back. We walked down the trail for about 20 minutes, and just when I thought it would never end, we came to this huge clearing. It was a massive open field of overgrown grass. It was huge, like a golf course. We couldn't even see the other side from where we were standing. I was relieved to be out of that narrow trail, but I don't think any of us were expecting to find such a vast open space. To our right, there was this old, run-down house a few hundred yards away, and we decided to check it out. The house was pitch black, no cars, no signs of anyone living there. We walked over and shined our flashlights at it, and sure enough, all the windows and doors were boarded up. I managed to peek through the cracks in the boards of one window, and all I could see was an old white couch covered in plastic. The rest of the room was totally empty. Whoever used to live there was long gone. Since there was no way to get into the house, and because we were all sufficiently creeped out by it, we decided to head back closer to the trail and take a break in the field. But before we could even sit down, one of my friends started freaking out and pointing out into the field, back towards the house. We all turned to look, and there, in the moonlight, we saw this tall, lanky figure who appeared to be dancing. The moon was super bright, and the woods were so dark, it took us a second to really grasp what we were seeing. It was a figure, someone or something, dancing as it moved closer to the house we'd just been at. Then this happened. The figure stopped dancing, looked right at us, and then charged straight towards us. We all completely freaked out and bolted back to the trail. The walk-in had taken about 20 minutes, but we made it back to our cars, jumped in, and sped away in about 5. That experience is always in the back of my mind. It's the kind of thing you just don't forget. What really gets me is that whoever that was, they were dancing like a maniac in the woods at 1 a.m, and then just ran straight at a group of 7 young adults, not at all bothered that they were outnumbered. I still wonder if they'd seen us the moment we'd parked and if the noises I kept hearing on the trail were them. Whatever it was, whether it was a real person or something paranormal, it was absolutely terrifying. Way more of an adventure than we'd bargained for. Many years ago, I was black powder hunting alone one night in Kentucky on some private property. It was late fall. The air was crisp and carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The property had a gated entrance, a heavy iron gate that groaned when opened, so I'd park my four-wheeler just inside, under the skeletal branches of a giant oak, and usually walk the remaining 200 yards or so to my elevated deer stand. The path was narrow and winding, barely more than a deer trail worn into the forest floor. As I shut off the four-wheeler, the sudden silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. I put on my backpack, a heavy canvas thing filled with supplies, and that's when I heard it. A very large branch snap, like something big was moving around maybe 20 yards away, deeper in the woods. It wasn't the sharp crack of a small twig, but a deep, resonant snap that echoed through the trees. I initially thought it was a deer or some other animal moving around, maybe a raccoon or even a wild hog. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Gathered my gun, a heavy black powder rifle, and the rest of my hunting gear, and started walking down the trail, my boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. The moon was nearly full, casting long, distorted shadows that danced among the trees, providing just enough light to see the path ahead. I didn't turn on my flashlight because the moonlight was sufficient, and also because I knew the path by heart, every twist and turn. As I walked deeper into the woods, I quickly realized something was paralleling my every step, moving through the underbrush on my left. It wasn't a distinct sound, but more of a subtle rustling, the soft crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I'd walk a few steps and stop, listening intently, and whatever it was would do the same, the rustling ceasing abruptly. The hair on the back of my neck began to prickle. By the time I fully realized what was happening, that I was being followed, it was too late to comfortably go back to the four-wheeler. The thought of turning my back on whatever was out there made my stomach churn. So, I picked up my pace, trying to appear nonchalant while internally panicking, and made a beeline for my deer stand, a rickety wooden structure perched about 15 feet up in a large oak. When I got within about 10 yards of the stand, I heard another loud branch snap, this time much closer, almost directly to my left. It was so close it made me jump. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest, switched on my flashlight, and shined it in that direction. And then I saw them. 2 glowing green eyes, about 10 inches apart, reflecting the light back at me like twin emeralds. They were low to the ground, maybe 2 or 3 feet up. Instinctively, I raised my rifle, the cold metal a comfort in my trembling hands, and stomped my foot hard on the ground, trying to scare whatever it was away. It just blinked its eyes, once, slowly, almost lazily, and didn't move an inch. I still couldn't make out any details of the creature, just the eerie green glow of its eyes against the dark backdrop of the woods. It was definitely crouched down, judging by the proximity of the eyes to the ground. Whatever this thing was, the way it held its position, the way it didn't react to my attempt to scare it, it felt like a predator, and I instantly knew the best thing to do was to bolt up my ladder and get into the relative safety of my deer stand as fast as possible. The ladder was no more than 8 steps away, a short, steep climb, and I knew that if I'd tried to shoot at it in the dark, I would have been temporarily blinded by the muzzle flash, leaving me vulnerable to attack if I missed. I basically just said a quick prayer, a silent plea for protection, and managed to scramble up the ladder into my deer stand without being attacked. For the rest of the night, As I waited anxiously for daybreak, the creature circled my stand just outside the range of my flashlight beam. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, the constant rustling and occasional snap of a twig keeping me on edge. The hours crawled by, each minute feeling like an eternity. Right before dawn, as the first hints of light began to filter through the trees, I heard it move off into the woods, back in the direction it had followed me from. I stayed up in my stand for a good part of the morning, long after the sun had fully risen, just to be sure it was gone, and then quickly, cautiously, made my way back to my four-wheeler. Just before I started the engine, I heard one last loud branch snap from the edge of the woods. I didn't even look. I just started the engine, threw it into gear, and got out of there, driving straight home, cutting my planned week-long hunt drastically short. I didn't go back to that property to hunt until the following spring. I've never hunted the same way since that night, and I rarely venture out on foot after dark anymore, especially alone. I even sold that property the next spring. I was just too shaken, too deeply disturbed by whatever had been hunting me out there in the dark.